yeah. This one here for you, this one right here. Yeah, this one here. This go out to you, this for my home, my love. Yeah, yeah. This for my phone. You know me, yeah.
All right, team. Kia ora. Welcome to Korero Cafe. This is very exciting. This is our first ever. Welcome, everyone. Korero Cafe, this is a good time. It's hosted by Ara Taiohi, and I will be your host today. My name is Zara, and this is Bilal here, who is also, our panelist, or the person that we're interviewing. And I'll introduce you formally shortly, Bilal, but just so that you all know, we're stoked to have him here, and we're very excited to be running Korero Cafe for the first time. So thank you for coming to our attendees. It's great to see you here. I'm just stoked that people turned up. So what a good time this is going to be. Let me start very quickly with a karakia so that we can begin this session in a way that is grounding and beautiful. So, whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te ata kura, he tio, he huka, he hohu, ti hei, mauri ora. I heard your mauri oras from home. Thank you very much. Kia ora everyone, welcome to Korero Cafe. My name is Zara. If you haven't picked up, what we're going for is a bit of a cafe kind of vibes. So thanks for the sweet beats, Bilal. Man, I'm not sure what I was like, wow, that's not my typical white girl music. So thank you for helping me out with that one. Love it. If you want, grab yourself a hot drink. I've got a panda mug full of a cup of tea. This is rose hip and hibiscus with a recommended brewing time of 3 to 5 minutes. I also have with me a cookie that I made last night, looking very lovely. It's actually got peanut butter in the middle of it, and I can't really recommend more. I'm quite proud of my baking creation. So if you don't have something with you, go and run and grab it now so that we can all kind of do the best that we can and share kai together in this weird season of Rahui is what I've been calling it. And because it is a season, it won't last, but maybe Korero Cafe will. That would be cool. Let us know in the comments if you enjoy today and you're keen to see this keep running. So I work for an organisation called Ara Taiohi. They're incredible. We're the peak body for youth development in Aotearoa. My role there is I'm the Korowai Tupu manager. Korowai Tupu is the professional association for youth workers, and I basically just get to hang out with the best of the best, most epic people all day, every day. And welcome Rod, the extrovert who put his hand up as soon as he got here. He's also the chair of the Korowai Tupu Ropu, so it's great to have you here to tautoko what Ara Taiohi's up to today. And thank you very much to everyone else who's come along too. Epic to have some of our staff team here, and epic to have a bunch of other people. I'm actually pretty impressed, so thank you for coming. A little bit of housekeeping in terms of using Zoom. Not sure if you're familiar with Zoom webinars. Not everybody will be. I recommend using gallery view for today. There's also, so if you're not on gallery view, have a go at that. That's a good one. Normally I'd recommend the other, but let's go for gallery view today. Also, there's a chat function at the bottom, so feel free to use this. Looks like some people are already. Give us a hi or a cheers or oh my goodness, you're so beautiful, Bilal. That would be lovely. We'd love to hear that too. Also, you'll notice there is a Q&A feature too. Somebody's already asked what's for morning tea, and the answer is Zara's freshly baked peanut butter cookies. So thank you for that. So yes, feel free to use that. It would be great to hear what you're thinking as we go. So very good. So today we're going for kind of like a little bit of a digital book club type thing. If you haven't bumped into one of these before, this is called Kaipara Huarahi. This is a youth worker's journal, which there's 2 editions of. This is the 2nd edition, and it is fresh hot off the press, only a few months old. So we'll be going through some of these articles, and the one that we're going through today is this one, Te Ao, which is written by Bilal. If you haven't had a chance to read this article in advance, you're actually very lucky because Bilal's sweet, smoothing voice is going to hit us with this article very soon. But Bilal, I will let you introduce yourself. It would be lovely to hear what you have to say. Bilal is a longtime friend of Ara Taiohi, so we're stoked to have him today. He lives in Titirangi in Auckland, and he's currently studying clinical psychology, which gets mad respect from me. He also has a whopper of a story, which you may have read, and if you haven't, you'll hear about it today. So Bilal, let's hear a little bit about you.
Nami, Zara, thank you so much for the kind introduction and for calling me so beautiful. I don't know if I'd use the same words to describe myself. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Like Zara said, my name is Bilal. At the moment, I'm living in Titirangi, so I'm in the beautiful bush. We don't get too much sun because we're surrounded by trees, but hey, I'll take what I've got. So yeah, at the moment, my time is occupied mostly by my study. So I'm studying full-time at Auckland Uni towards my doctorate in clinical psychology. And after having worked at the Red Cross for about 2 years and doing some other youth work with Empower Youth, I kind of felt the maybe the need or there was a drive that I wanted to kind of upskill a bit more, and I was seeing some of the issues coming up in amongst former refugee youth around mental health needs and that kind of thing, and I felt I wasn't equipped enough to be able to support them in the way that they needed most. So I decided to embark on another 4 years of uni study. So I'm in year 2 now, and the project I'm doing at the moment is looking at how Muslim youth have kind of responded and experienced the March 15th attacks last year. So it's quite a heavy topic, but something I feel that needs to be explored and kind of researched, just so that we have an understanding of what the extent of the impacts of that trauma from last year, but also how best to support Muslim youth and young people from refugee backgrounds who may have been in some ways re-traumatized by what occurred last year. So that's what I'm kind of occupied with at the moment. I'm really blessed to be living with my family and my fiance at the moment during the Sahui, so things are looking good. No arguments yet, which is a big feat for us, 3 weeks in of just constant being in each other's faces. But yeah, so that's where we're at the moment.
Awesome, thank you very much, Bilal. It's very exciting to hear from you directly today. And as even of your intro, you're referencing to your own story and how that influences the mahi that you do. So I'm very excited to hear a little bit more about this. So if you happen to have, to our listeners, if you happen to have your copy of Kaipara Huarahi on you, you're welcome to follow along. Bilal's going to read his article, so if having a visual kind of follow on is helpful for you, you're welcome to do that, or you can just kind of sit back and relax and enjoy Bilal's sweet voice. So in this we'll hear more about his story too. So take it away, Bilal.
Awesome. Just for reference, it's on page 24 if you're scrolling through.
Oh, very good.
And I think there was a digital copy uploaded online, so if you don't have the physical copy, there is a digital copy as well. Anyway, Te Ao, Afghanistan Te Aotearoa, A Journey from Guilt into Gratitude. You know those films you study in English at high school? The ones your teacher makes you watch over and over again to analyze every scene in detail? Well, in my year 11 English class, we watched Slumdog Millionaire. I still remember that movie very vividly, more than 8 years after watching it at school. The protagonist in the film, Jamal Malik, experiences a series of tumultuous, life-changing events throughout his childhood and adolescence that inadvertently give him the knowledge he needs to answer every question in the TV show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The combination of these events, which seem unrelated at the time, led Jamal to success. For the audience within the film, the success was Jamal winning the grand prize of 20 million rupees. But for Jamal himself, it was finding his long-lost partner, Latika. Looking back now, in many ways, my early life can also be described as a series of tumultuous, life-changing events. My family escaped Afghanistan, infamous for its reputation as one of the world's most dangerous countries, to get to a safer country. Each day for 4 months, my parents risked their lives in freedom, while a human trafficker smuggled us from country to country. Every new day gave rise to a new set of questions. How would we get out of Jakarta, where we were put into a hotel with drug smugglers for several nights? Where would we eat in Kuala Lumpur? How much longer would we spend in Port Moresby after having been stranded there for 1 month already? Understandably, the biggest question constantly at the forefront of my parents' minds was when we would be caught and sent back. or even worse, become stranded in a transit country with nowhere else to go. The unknown haunted them every day of the 4 grueling months, and as more of the people who were being smuggled alongside us got caught, the less hope they would be left with that we would make it to safety. Thankfully, when we were eventually caught, it was inside Wellington Airport. A group of Afghan refugees seeking asylum in Aotearoa made newspaper headlines. Among this group of refugees was me, a 4-year-old boy. Like any toddler, I was oblivious to the world around me. I was oblivious to the turmoil we'd escaped from, and until very recently, oblivious to the extent of sacrifice my parents had made and were prepared to make to ensure our safety. One chilling story that my dad recounted for the first time only a few years ago was my family's experience of crossing the border from Afghanistan to Pakistan. Hidden in the cabin of a cargo truck was my family, a young couple with their toddler and newborn baby. As the truck approached the border, my father placed his elbow in my newly born brother's mouth, a desperate attempt to keep him quiet while the truck was being inspected. They sat absolutely still and hoped for the best. My dad told me that my brother was only seconds away from suffocating when the border inspector slammed the door shut and told the driver to move along. The sense of relief my dad experienced in that moment was unlike anything he had ever felt before. Hearing this story of my dad being forced into a position no person should ever have to be, needing to take the life of a newborn child to save the rest of the family, was one story among many that allowed me to begin to comprehend just how much my parents had sacrificed for our futures. Upon our arrival to Aotearoa, after months of uncertainty and anxiousness, my family's case for asylum was accepted and we were granted refugee status. This was the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. My family could finally stop running. Coincidentally, exactly 18 years later, in the very same city where I first set foot as an asylum seeker, I returned to as a young adult to attend a professional development festival hosted by Ara Taiohi. It was here where I stumbled into Mark Fredo, a psychologist from the United States who had come to present. He spotted the Ripika Whero New Zealand Red Cross badge on my shirt and initiated what I now consider to be one of the most transformative conversations I've had in my life. We went through brief introductions, the usual small talk, what my role as a resettlement youth worker entailed. He and Marty, his wife, told me that they were very impressed with the work my colleagues and I were doing alongside newly arrived former refugee youth. As they asked about my personal life, I began to reveal a little bit more about my past, something I was unaccustomed to doing at the time, given the stigma around being a refugee. We discussed how my family's experience of escaping Afghanistan and arriving in Aotearoa informed my work through a lived experience approach. I then divulged something that I had only ever thought to myself but never said out loud. I told Mark and Marty that I often felt a sense of guilt. This guilt seemed to stem from having the privilege of making it out alive with all of my family around me. Here I was, living a comfortable Western lifestyle, traveling across the country to conferences, and mixing and mingling with colleagues at fancy venues. At the same time, my own family members were stranded back home in a conflict zone. In my work, my privileged lifestyle continued to contrast the young people I journeyed alongside. Some had lost their parents at a young age. Others felt isolated because they were forced to leave their friends and extended family behind. Most had a difficult time adjusting because their English-speaking skills prevented them from participating in mainstream society. After I finished describing this inner conflict I'd been having, Mark explained to me that my guilt was not doing me any favors. According to him, as long as I felt guilty for having the privileges I have, I would be debilitated. His advice was that I instead needed to mobilize my privilege and turn that guilt into gratitude. With this mindset, I could appreciate my life while also being able to make a positive impact on the lives of young people I journeyed alongside. It was the first time I had heard this perspective, and although I didn't immediately take to the idea, I spent that night mulling over what he told me. The following week, I returned to my work. Only now I had a different outlook and a new principle to guide me: guilt into gratitude. It wasn't long, however, until that guilt crept up again. This time, it was following the terrorist attacks in Christchurch on March 15th, 2019. I felt guilty because I hadn't been going to Juma prayers as often as I should have. I felt guilty because I hadn't experienced what the worshippers inside those two mosques were going through, yet I was still grieving. I felt guilty because I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. And then it kicked in. I actively began on transforming my guilt into gratitude. Once I'd made some progress on resetting my perspective of the situation, I decided to take up an offer to travel down to Otautahi. Since then, I've been lucky enough to be involved with running community mental health workshops alongside a group of incredibly passionate and skilled Muslim psychologists. I continue to mobilize my privilege of not being directly affected by the attacks, rather than be consumed by it, to connect the young Muslims in Otautahi with organizations and agencies who wanted to offer their support. It was only through this active process of recognizing the same feelings of guilt I had experienced earlier in my life, and then working on reshaping them, that I could begin to serve others. My guilt had once again turned into gratitude. Reflecting on that chance encounter with Mark, I realized that I'd struck my own $1 million moment. Like Jamal, a series of apparently unrelated events had taken place that resulted in a moment that would forever change my life. My journey from Afghanistan to Aotearoa had led to my role at Ipika Whero. While there, I was granted access to the wonderful world of youth work that ultimately resulted in my conversation with Mark. And it was through my conversation with him that I learned how to overcome what was holding me back. Although I didn't win the grand prize of 20 million rupees, I did win an invaluable life lesson. I learned how to transform my guilt into gratitude, and most importantly, to utilize that gratitude to serve my community.
Beautiful, stunning. Thank you very much, Bilal. I wasn't expecting to be quite so moved by that when you read it, so forgive me. I'd like to give you 20 million rupees. If only that were a possibility. Thank you very much. I love that you've chosen to embrace your story and use it to help others. It's absolutely beautiful, and it's cool to hear a little bit about that, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit more of that later on too. So quick question for you, does reading this article bring up emotions for you too?
Well, it feels like I'm in my year 11 English class again, and the teacher's asking me to read out loud. There's a lot of trauma in that, but no, yeah, it definitely does, because it's, I think, something that it's something that is very near and dear to me. And even being asked to write about it, initially I was hesitant, because once you've put something out like this out into the world, you don't know how it's going to be perceived or what's going to happen with it. And so reading it over and over again, and sometimes, there's a difference between when you read it in your mind or reading it out loud. So when you actually say some of those things and are forced to actually verbalize some of that stuff, yeah, it can still move you, even though I've probably told that story, tens and 20s, 10, 20 times over.
Yeah.
Still does move me.
Yeah, I bet. Very cool. Hey, and I think the part of the story that really hits me quite hard is the story about your brother and your dad. Man, it just gets me in the feels. How's your brother? Is he all right?
he's totally fine now. Yeah. Honestly, that I remember my dad telling me about that, and even just the way he talked about it too. After so many years of not saying that to anybody, obviously it was something that he was holding inside himself, and it was only when he felt like I was ready, and I was an adult at the time. That's when he finally felt like it was okay for him to tell me that story. And for him, it wasn't an easy decision to make. I've summarized it in like a paragraph. You could make a whole movie about that one moment in his life. So yeah, it's definitely something difficult. But yeah, my brother's totally fine. He's now a gym freak and probably 3 times my size, and you could probably bench press me.
Awesome, great. I hope that one day I will get to meet him. Very cool. Hey, thanks so much. I've got a few questions for you, and we've got a couple that have popped up in the Q&A feature. So if off the back of hearing Bilal's story, you want to ask a question, feel free to pop that up in the Q&A. And I've got a couple here already though, which I'd love to ask you. So Bilal, you've talked about, so we're talking about Te Ao today, which is the world, Te Ao Taiohi, the world of a young person. And you've shared some of the big picture influences in your own life, and you touched on earlier about how the March shootings will likely be a huge big picture influence in the life of Muslims in New Zealand, especially in Ōtautahi. What do you think are some other big influences for a lot of young people in Aotearoa?
Obviously the immediate stuff at the moment, being in Rahui, being in lockdown, like we've got this looming thing over our heads that there's a pandemic and we don't know what's going to happen, and all the uncertainty that comes along with that. So obviously that's front and center for a lot of people, especially for a lot of young people who, their everyday lives have been disrupted. you know, in terms of going to school or going out and seeing their friends and even connecting with other people and that kind of thing. And, you know, last year was a big year in terms of the climate strike. So that's obviously, it's just because we're in the middle of a pandemic doesn't mean that, you know, we're not still in the midst of climate change globally. So there's all these kinds of things going on, and, you know, social media is always something that comes up in conversation when we're talking about young people and how that's this big force. And a lot of times I think it gets described, or it's kind of captured as this thing that's, you know, all the perils of social media. Young people are on too many social media things for too much time and that kind of thing. But actually, at a time like now with the pandemic, you know, we're using a social media platform at the moment to connect with one another. And if it wasn't for social media and for all of the things, all of the benefits that come from it, we would be far more isolated than what we are. I think specifically in an Aotearoa context, we can't have a conversation around big picture things without talking about some of the systemic things around the historical but also contemporary issues around colonization. And I think we tend to maybe sometimes think of colonization as something that kind of happened in the past, and it was, you know, the colonial era and something that happened, you know, a while ago, and now we're kind of past all that. But actually, I would argue that it's something that's present in our modern context, but also all of that historical stuff very much plays a huge role in our interactions and our social structures and that kind of thing in the present day as well.
You're so smart. I could literally just listen to you just keep talking, which is good. That's what we want. So please keep talking. I'm really interested, particularly in the colonization kind of side of things, and I'm keen to hear. Just tell us, how do you feel colonization affects Te Ao Taiohi?
I think it's less about how I feel about it personally, but I think. You know, given the history that Aotearoa has, and sometimes the very little we know about that history, I think that's where we kind of run into some issues. And what I kind of mean by that, you know, for young people especially, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is around how we almost seem to have an amnesia, or kind of this forgetting of what happened in the past, and then there seems to be, I guess, a divide between what happened, you know, 100, 120, 30 years ago and what's happening today. So drawing some of those connections between what happened then and what's happening now, where especially for young Māori, you know, living in rural regions, or even in urban regions too, a lot of that, you know, it can be drawn back to the effects of colonization, and how, you know, being or forcibly having your culture and aspects of your identity removed, and being you know, forcibly assimilated into a Pākehā or Te Ao Pākehā, that in and of itself is a hugely influential force in the lives of young people in the present day. And, you know, recently there has been a big shift towards a lot of people, Māori and non-Māori, learning Te Reo Māori. And so even that in itself, that's a huge, I think, a huge wave of young people who are reconnecting with their language, but at the same time with that comes the mamai, or the whakamā around not actually being aware of, or not knowing Te Reo Māori. And so things like that, I think, still play out in the present day for young people. And as youth workers, for us to be aware of that, to not simply see that young person that we're working alongside or journeying alongside as being this person, you know, taking them at face value, but actually recognizing that historical context, and then moving beyond that and recognizing how that historical context applies into the modern day, and how some of those things might play out for particular groups, and specifically Māori.
Yeah, wow. I love right at the beginning of that you said, well, it's not actually about how I feel, and that that humble approach, I feel, is right at the core of everything else that you said, following on from that. But you're right. There's so many things which shape. Kind of what you're talking about underneath all of this. You're talking about identity and how the big picture shapes the young person's identity, which is very cool. Keen to touch on something else, which is you've talked to us about kind of the extraordinary experience that you had in your life. However, I feel like something like colonization, and perhaps there's a lot of other things, is it's now and today in 2020. I think colonization probably had some very big, extraordinary events before our time, which we now see the after effects of now. But what about the ordinary things? What about the things that happen every day? How do those things shape us?
Yeah, I think so much of that big picture stuff seeps into, or in a lot of ways influences our ordinary everyday experiences, whether they're positive experiences or experiences of microaggression and people making, quote unquote, just jokes about certain things. So I think separating out the two is obviously helpful, but actually, again, seeing them as part of a larger picture can actually be equally helpful in terms of recognizing how our interactions and how our sense of self or our identity is determined by those bigger picture things. Speaking from a personal perspective, like I said in that story, for me, recognizing that, okay, I'd known from obviously very early on in my life that we had this refugee experience, but all throughout my life, I recognized that there was a stigma in Western contexts around being open about this fact, of being open about the fact that I did have this experience. So, that's one of those big picture things, is the stigma and the shame that comes with being a refugee. And for me, that translated into me denying that identity and saying, well, actually, no, my family just migrated here, or even denying that I am from where I'm from. So coming up with something a little more exotic, or, shifting that or changing that description I had of myself, or changing that identity that I had of myself, so that I would be able to fit into those more, fit in easily into the dominant cultural norms and that kind of thing. So yeah, so much of that stuff plays out, I think, in our interactions in everyday life, but also how we internalize some of those ideas that are around, and how that influences how we see ourselves. That, to me, is what I'm really interested in seeing for young people, especially because they are going through this period of, discovering their identity, if you will, or coming to terms with who they are and what their place is in the world. It is such a hugely pivotal time in their lives, and I feel that that big picture stuff, or that stuff, those discourses around what it means to be Maori, or what it means to be Muslim, or what it means to be, in a part of the rainbow community, or whatever it is, those things go a long way in determining how we view ourselves, and at times they can set the trajectory for young people throughout their entire lives.
Farah, so just to give a little bit of background off the back of what you're saying. So in talking about Te Ao Taiohi, this is part of a larger framework which is called Mana Taiohi. If you're not on board with Mana Taiohi yet, it's coming for you. This is to replace the youth development strategy of Aotearoa is now the principles of Mana Taiohi. And although we're talking about Te Ao Taiohi today, the big picture of the world of young people, what I can hear you talking about in there is little things about whakapapa, or the mauri of a young person, which are all part of this wider Mana Taiohi framework, which is very, very cool. So thanks heaps, Bilal. We've had a few questions come through, if you're happy to answer them. Many of them are about your story, and so feel free to say, oh, look, that's irrelevant, or not that these are very relevant, but if it's too personal or something, you don't have to answer them. You can say, you're welcome to
Sure.
fob them off. So one of the questions is, how was it for your parents migrating and integrating into Aotearoa, New Zealand? So how was it for your parents?
Well, they've had quite, I think, a different experience to what I've had. So for my parents, they arrived here as adults who had experienced what life was like prior to a war, prior to being forcibly displaced. So, they had their family, they had their jobs, they had their normal everyday lives back home. So for them, I think there's been, in a lot of ways, a grieving process around having lost so much that they're not able to get back. And I contrast that with my personal experience because, I left, when we left, I was 4 years old. And, there's very little that I was attached to in terms of, friends or school or whatever back home. So for me, it was almost like starting new again, but I hadn't been, I wasn't forced to give up as much as what my parents were. So for them, and there's still constant struggles in their day-to-day lives. As a adult, 30, 40-year-old adults being dropped into another country and being expected to pick up the language immediately and all the cultural norms and, find employment and all that kind of stuff. That has been, I think, and it continues to be a struggle for my parents. My father works as an Uber driver, and some of the stories I hear from his experiences of working as an Uber driver, where he's viewed as someone who's one of those migrant workers and that kind of thing, and actually people don't necessarily recognize that he's got this entire experience in another country where he was home and where he could speak the language fluently, and so one of the things actually this Rahui has helped me see. I at the moment I'm working at Auckland Museum, but because the museum's shut down, the project I'm working on has been put on hold, and in a lot of ways, so many other people have been made redundant and lost their jobs and that kind of thing. And this experience kind of triggered something like a thought in my head around my parents having lost so much when they had to migrate. So back home, my dad was a doctor and he worked at a children's hospital, and now he's working as an Uber driver and has been doing that for the past 20 or so years we've been here. And so for him, there was this loss, and there was this recognition that he would lose his employment and everything that came with that, and the fulfillment that he got from his job as a doctor, making this journey halfway across the world. And I think, myself and one of my friends were having a conversation the other week, and we were talking about how his job, he was going to be made redundant, and my job was kind of, in the balance, or like it was uncertain about what was going to happen with it. And we were both so worried, and we were thinking, oh no, what if I have to work a retail job again, because we've both worked many years in retail. And it was like, it's almost this disempowering, or the sense of shame, or, like you've really lost something, a big part of your life, because we worked so hard to get these jobs and to get this work. And then all of a sudden it's being taken away from us for no fault of our own, not because we'd done anything wrong or we weren't performing or anything like that, but actually it was because of the pandemic. And he's also a former refugee, and his family are from Ethiopia, and he described the same thing. And he said, what has that been like for our parents who, there's never, for us, even if we had to go back into kind of retail jobs and that kind of thing, or, be underemployed for a while, there's always this prospect that, we'll be able to get back to where we were. But for our parents, that's never been on the cards, and they've had to come to terms with that. So I think that was one of those profound experiences that I've had very recently still. And so, it really hit home for me that, this Rahui, or this pandemic is affecting a lot of people in a lot of ways, and it can bring up a lot of things for people.
Yeah. One of the other questions that's come through perhaps is a good follow-on from that. You talked in your article about transforming guilt into gratitude.
Yes.
And I feel like off the back of what you've just said, perhaps it's more than just turning guilt into gratitude. Perhaps it could be a sense of grief, turning grief into gratitude. So do you have any ideas, or the question is, what are some positive ways that young people can transform their guilt into gratitude?
Well, that's a tough question.
Are there any things that have worked for you that you could pass on? Yep.
Well, for me, because my guilt stemmed from, I guess, the privilege that I had, that is, once I kind of was forced to kind of like view that privilege, but from a lens of being able to enact or work on that privilege for the betterment of other people. That's when I think I kind of started to put that feeling of guilt to the side. So I don't know, I don't like giving out like advice, but if people are feeling guilty for whatever reason, or if they are grieving for whatever reason, I think it's a very deeply personal experience, and finding the meaning making from that is a personal process. But in terms of that guilt that comes from privilege, I think, yeah, that requires that self-reflection and being able to really examine that guilt and seeing where it comes from, and then finding ways that you can mobilize that or actually put that to use, to help yourself, but actually help other people too.
Oh, awesome. And just to add on to that too, I think some people, perhaps people as intelligent as yourself, are able to do that process quite well on their own, but also utilizing other people as well,
Yes,
like
yeah.
talking to a good counselor, like 1737 or Youthline, any of some, to do that journey alongside somebody else, or with a good youth worker as well. Very cool.
Yeah.
This is also about the Rahui and about you personally. This person's asked, how has this Rahui impacted your Muslim faith as an individual and also as a family?
Truth be told, I'm not the best practicing Muslim. I don't pray as often as I should, and I don't do a lot of the other religious practices.
I feel like every Muslim I've ever talked to has said that.
I don't know. I think we're constantly comparing ourselves to one another, and it's like, oh, that person's praying 3 times a day. I'm only doing it twice. I got to up my game a little bit. But no, being at home and having fewer distractions in terms of being so busy and everything else that we're doing outside, I've actually found that I've had more time to be doing some more prayers and using that time as a family. So with Muslim people, you can obviously just pray individually, but you can also pray in congregation. And so in the evening prayers, the Maghrib prayers, when the sun sets, my family have all been praying together. The rest of the day, people are doing the individual prayers, but at that time of day, it's a nice time for us to, we have dinner, and then right after, we all get ready and we wash and we pray. So it's almost like a mindfulness exercise, if you will, or kind of this cool experience of being surrounded by family in that deeply spiritual state. And I know a lot of people are making meaning or finding different ways of coping with the Rahui, whether that's in terms of leaning towards religion or non-religious practices. But yeah, for me, I have actually found more time to be engaging in that stuff, whereas normally I'd be too busy with everything else that's going on in my life.
Cool, very cool. We've got a very interesting question here, and I'm wondering if there's a story that I don't know about that I simply must know. Tell me, Bilal, would you consider yourself a hero after helping someone who was locked in a Christchurch toilet?
That's my good friend Simon Mariko. So in this article, I talked about going down to Otautahi. What I didn't say was I got to go down with the amazing Simon Mariko and Daisy Lavia Timo from MYD. And we were sitting in a restaurant having dinner after a long day and just debriefing and that kind of thing. We'd pretty much finished our meals, and Simon got up and said, I'm going to get up and go to the toilet before we head off. So Daisy and I sat there. We, being good listeners, we were listening to one another talk, so we weren't paying attention to our phones. But actually, Simon was stuck in the toilet, and he was texting and calling both of us to say, hey, can someone please help me? The door's locked. And he couldn't get out of the toilet. And Daisy and I chatting away, and it's like 5 minutes had passed, 10 minutes had passed, and I thought, we had a big meal. Maybe the guy needs to go to the toilet. That's right. I think 25 or 30 minutes had passed, and then I finally kind of like peered over towards my phone, and I looked, and I was getting a call from Simon, and I was like, what? I picked it up, and I answered, and he goes, hey, bro, could you please come to the toilet? I'm stuck in here. So Daisy and I dropped what we were doing, went over to the toilets, and it turns out the door wasn't even locked. He just had to push it a little bit harder than what he had to, but he was ready to knock the thing down. But I said, Simon, just pull on the door. I'm pretty sure it'll open, because I'd gone to the toilet before he had, and I actually had the same experience, but my MacGyver skills kicked in. Unfortunately, he didn't have that same sense, so I had to rescue him from the toilet. But no, I wouldn't consider myself a hero, Simon.
I'd consider you a hero. I also am wondering if perhaps the answer to the age-old question of why often do girls go together in groups, it's actually just health and safety.
Health and safety. Exactly.
Maybe that's the reason why. Another question here for you is, we here, actually, before I get into that, I want you all to see my incredible baking creation. Look at that. That's peanut butter in the middle of that cookie.
How do you get it in the center?
That's the art. Messy fingers is the answer to that. So the question that we've got here is, can we hear more about your research? What are your current learnings? And perhaps maybe if even your research relates to this Te Ao Taiohi even.
At the moment, I'm still very early on, so I'm doing a lot of the background stuff into looking at the experiences of people following traumatic experiences, specifically around terrorist attacks. And so there's a lot of stuff around vicarious trauma, where people who have not necessarily directly experienced the traumatic event themselves, but heard about it or witnessed it or seen it through media and that kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of research that's come out following 9/11, because obviously the scale of those attacks in 2001 were huge. And so there's a lot of stuff around that, and a little bit of research around stuff, or some of the events or the attacks that took place in places like Hungary and Poland, and where there's been some more of the right-wing terrorist attacks. Unfortunately, in my, from what I've looked, or from my searching so far, I haven't found anything that's actually come out directly as a result of the Christchurch attacks in terms of research with people who've been affected by it. So there's not much I can say about that just yet. Hopefully in 3 years' time, when I've completed my project and I've done all the interviews and the analyses and that kind of thing, I'd be able to give it a little bit more info. But at this stage, I'm still quite early on in the project and just kind of scoping out what has been done previously and what can be done with this project specifically. So I don't have too much to offer just yet, but in terms of what I can say is that, you know, there are certain, there's more to trauma than just being directly witnessing trauma, but, you know, there is plenty of literature that talks around vicarious trauma, and that's something I'm really interested in because, you know, as we know, that the attacks last year were obviously, were targeted at the worshippers in the 2 mosques in Christchurch, but actually, for a lot of people, a lot of Muslims around the country, they felt like their entire identity had come under attack. And so that's what I'm really keen to explore, is how people living both within Christchurch, but actually outside Christchurch too, have made sense of that, and how that might have impacted on their identity and how they view their place in Aotearoa.
And again, there we go, full circle. We're talking about identity within the scope of the bigger picture again. Man, I honestly, let's actually have coffee. I'm keen to hang out and hear way more about this. We've got 2 more questions here, and then we'll finish up. Our goal is to be under an hour today, team. So we're hoping to finish up by about 20 past. Just to give you a heads up on that. So we've got 2 more questions. One of them is around the music that was playing at the start, but I'll leave that one till last. Because we've just had one come through from Jane saying, you talked about privilege. Is there any thoughts on how people who have white privilege can turn their guilt into gratitude? And I'm very interested in this, because even as you were speaking about at the beginning, about how the revival of Te Reo Māori has meant that a lot of Māori and non-Māori have been learning Te Reo. I'm one of those non-Māori who have been learning Te Reo, trying to speak and learning different sentence structures and things, and I've really enjoyed it. However, I've had to be very careful that it's not just me continuing to take from a culture. And so I'm very interested in how people with white privilege can turn their guilt into gratitude as well. So thank you for that question, Jane. Please solve the world's problems, Bilal.
It feels like that's what it feels like this is what this is about a little bit. But no, actually, let me just start with what you just said, Zara. Around, I also have been on that journey of, you know, trying to learn Te Reo Māori, and like you, I think I've now actually begun to understand a lot more around. It's more than simply learning a language, and I think what's kind of led to me understanding that is, again, understanding some of the contextual stuff behind all of that, and learning that, you know, it was literally beaten out of people, out of Māori, so that they could no longer speak at schools and that kind of thing. So for us as non-Māori to now be learning it, well, yes, it's a shift in the right direction towards reviving the language or keeping it alive. At the same time, there's a lot of privilege that we have as non-Māori in being able to learn the language and not necessarily have any of the repercussions that come with speaking Māori publicly, or any of the historical trauma that goes along with having spoken Māori or having had that be your first language. So I think, yeah, so even in that, there's a lot of privilege in us to be able to take an aspect of a culture, and in a lot of ways that builds our social capital. At the moment, I'm wearing this taonga that was gifted to me, but I know for a lot of Māori people who don't necessarily feel comfortable having, outward displays of their Māori culture like this, out of fear of the repercussions that could come from that. So there truly is a lot of privilege in being able to do things like that as non-Māori. I don't know if I can speak on white privilege, but I think to draw a parallel with my experience, I think a lot of that takes that self-reflection, and it takes time to move through that process of, initially being confronted by that privilege, whatever it is, whether it's male privilege or whether it's white privilege, and then oftentimes, and I'm speaking from personal experience, our reaction to that can be denial, or to minimize that and be like, well, actually, no, that doesn't apply to me, or, well, I'm not one of those men who say things like this, or I'm not one of those white people that say something like this or thinks like that. But it's going beyond that and recognizing how we've been socialized, and we might not necessarily be aware of how we think in certain ways, or we value certain frameworks or certain knowledge bases over other knowledge bases. So I think it's a lifelong journey, and I don't think there's any easy one step to transitioning or converting that guilt into gratitude, whether it's white guilt or anything else. But yeah, I think the most important thing I have found anyway is to constantly engage in that self-reflection, and to constantly interrogate what you know to be right and true, and what you know to be, well, this is just how we do things. Interrogate that for yourself, because it can feel daunting or intimidating having someone else do that for you. So I think having the habit, or getting into that process of where you constantly do that for yourself, and then having those conversations with people who might be going through similar things to you, can help kind of make you feel less alone in that experience, I guess. And I think it's in that collective experience where we can kind of shift some of those experiences, or shift some of that power and that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't have any one easy solution to this. The one thing I can recommend is just constantly self-reflect, and to be critical of yourself, in the sense of just thinking things through, and really taking that time to think about how and why it is that you think the way you do. And then obviously with due time being able to put that into action, and maybe stepping aside if it comes to a certain event, and letting someone else do the speaking, or recognizing that your expertise isn't the expertise on a topic, but actually there are other knowledge bases that actually would be able to speak better to that than you would. And also,
which is exactly what you try to do now, is you're like, actually, this is what it does.
Yeah.
I love it. That's that is a tough question, and that you've answered that with a lot of wisdom and respect. I love that you said constantly interrogate what you know to be right and true. I actually wrote it down. I'm like, oh, I've got some interrogating to do for myself. That's beautiful. Very quickly, just to finish up, can you let us know what music was playing at the start? And
I'm glad whoever this anonymous attendee was that they asked the question. It was a very deliberate thing. So the album I was playing is called Avondale Bowling Club. Oh, that's backwards on this camera. New Zealand artist Tom Scott, and it's I'm into Te, so I'm pretty close to Avondale, but I grew up in Mount Roskill, and I grew up going to the Avondale markets. So this album very much speaks to the experience of Tom, having been born in Auckland and moving over to Australia, and then coming back to New Zealand, and that experience or journey for him of reconnecting with where he's at, or where he was from, and kind of connecting back to his roots in a way. So highly recommend this album. It's a very cool fusion of hip hop and jazz. So I recommend that.
Oh, Simon Mariko has said, I love Tom Scott.
Yes.
And then Jane also commented, I thought it was Simon's music, so that makes sense. Very, very cool. Hey, just as we finish up, Bilal, do you have any last final words, anything you've been dying to say? Secretly hoped there was a question about, or anything there?
No, I feel like I've talked so much, but thank you to all the guests. I think we've got double the number of attendees we initially expected, so I'm very grateful for everyone tuning in at 10:30 in the morning to listen to me ramble on. I hope that it's been a somewhat pleasant experience for you and that you're not sick of my voice. I certainly am sick of my own voice, so I'm going to sit and listen to music for the rest of the day so I don't have to hear myself talk. But, thank you everybody for tuning in. It's my first time doing a live Q&A session like this through Zoom. And I hope it's gone well. Yeah, ngā mihi.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Bilal. And I absolutely total what you've said. Today has been brilliant, I think. We're stoked with the amount of attendees that we've had. I'm not sure if people can see how many people are here, but we are very happy with that. Just to let you know that Korero Cafe will go on. We'll be back here next Thursday, which may or may not be the first day of not being in level 4 lockdown. Who knows what's going to happen there, but please watch this space. Keep an eye on the Ara Taiohi website and on social media to find out when the next one will be, so that we can let you know exactly how that will go ahead. Thank you very much, Bilal. Totally appreciate you spending some time with us here this morning. Very much appreciate your wisdom. It's been fantastic. And thank you to all of our attendees who took their time out this morning to get food envy from my cookie and also learn from the wisdom of Bilal. So thank you very much for that. I am going to end very quickly with another karakia. Feel free to let us know what you've thought. I see some thank yous and some lovely things coming in through the chat. So if there's anything you want to add to that, please do. And otherwise, thank you very much, team. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Let me end with karakia. Tātou kia tātou katoa. Te atawhai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaite. Me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhi ngātahitanga ki te wairua tapu. Ake, ake, ake. Āmine.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ara Taiohi, and everyone else.